how did the pelvis and the bones and the anatomy of a human, how do they end up differently than a chimp and compared to archaic species of hominids that aren't around anymore? And then you have to like line up the embryos literally, and you look at like the early stages of pelvis development, and you can say, okay, all of the apes kind of look similar, but then they become different. And then you can dig into the tissue differences and how they're moving differently once they start to develop differently at these stages of development. And then you can look at the DNA of these creatures and start to really say, okay, what was driving that? And what are the genomic differences that evolved to create that tissue difference in development that gives you the final end product having a different anatomy? So you're really cutting across like multiple, what you would call multiple fields of study here.
Exactly. And in the very beginning of this conversation, we talked about how we bring in data from a lot of different fields. Exactly. That's what we had to do. We're trying to connect the genotype, the genetic sequence to the phenotype, the physical appearance of traits, and we're bringing in all these levels of inquiry to do it. And so when we discovered these switches, we then had to say, well, do they have harbor sequences that look like they're evolved relative to other
Yeah.
primates. And that's not always easy to do either. And there's a notion out there in the field that existed for a while that one's going to find the gene that makes big brains, or the gene that gave a human culture, or the gene that gave language to humans, or the gene that made us upright. And the reality is that, well, first, as I mentioned, it's not the genes, it's the non-coding sequences, the other stuff. But it's not one region of the genome. And that was something that we discovered. We discovered that when we found these sequences, these switches that control the cartilage, and we found evolutionary signals in those sequences, it wasn't one switch, it was hundreds of switches. Hundreds of switches targeting lots of genes across the body, the developing ileum, developing pelvis. And that tells us that it's a bunch of changes of small effect, rather than one gene of large effect that can generate the biological phenotype that we look at. And I think that makes a lot of sense from the standpoint that you're evolving a structure that's so critical to walking. But remember also, the pelvis is also important for giving birth to a fetus, right? There's a birth canal that's formed by the pelvis. And so it's not like you can just change one thing very drastically without ramifications on other traits like giving birth, which is huge from
Mhm.
a Darwinian perspective, right? And so the fact that we found a whole bunch of changes, hundreds of changes of small effect, really suggests that this is a gradual process,
Right.
slowly changing the growth and trajectory of the developing ileum to make it short and broad. Why is that important? It helps us inform on the fossil record to say, what do we expect now when we look at the fossil record? Do we expect to find a form all of a sudden appearing at thin air that has flipped growth and a normal pelvis that looks like humans automatically? Or do we expect to find transitional fossils where the pelvic blades might have been rotated slowly and
Mhm.
slowly over
Mhm.
time? And the model that we have now is that polygenicity, the many different inputs that we're seeing genetically, likely reflect a more gradual rotational process. Now, it doesn't mean this gradual process didn't happen quickly. It could happen very quick because it's evolutionarily speaking, if it's something selectively
Right.
advantageous, it could
It
happen.
could have been 100,000 year process, which is
Yeah.
relatively quickly, but it's not like one day an ape gave birth to something that had this new kind of pelvis.
Yeah, just think about that. Like, and I've gotten people who have said, well, maybe it is one change. I'm like, well, think about it.